Welcome back to Proxy, everybody, and today we're going to be talking about how to control the board as Craftworld Eldar in 10th edition. So I made a video on this a while back talking about how to control the board in 9th edition, and I was rewatching it the other day and I kind of found a lot of irrelevancies and things that were outdated and stuff like that. So I did want to remake this video for you guys, update it, make it more relevant to 10th edition, and just also show you guys some cool new ways in which we can control the board with our shiny new special rules. So without further ado, let us go ahead and jump right into it and talk about how to control the board as Craftworld Eldar. So first, a quick overview of what we're going to be talking about today. We're going to be talking about what board control means in Warhammer 40k. We're going to be talking about the Craftworld Eldar's tools for helping control the board. And lastly, what you need to watch out for and how to position your forces. And I will give you guys a small diagram, which hopefully will help you kind of understand how to position your forces on the battlefield to achieve this. So for those newer players out there, you might be playing this game and maybe you've only been playing for a month or maybe a couple months, haven't had that many games, and you don't really know what board control is. After all, it's not in the rule book, it's not something they tell you, but it is certainly something that is in the game. It's just not directly stated in the rules. So what is board control? Well, board control is a player's ability to dictate their opponent's movements and actions on the battlefield. There are several things you can do in a game which will influence your opponent's decisions, using either special rules or unit placement. Examples could include blocking off certain areas of the board or creating a kill zone where if enemies enter, they will be promptly destroyed. Other board control tactics can include debuffing enemy movement, or setting up powerful overwatch so that your opponent can't move to the places in the board that they want to easily. And at its essence, that is kind of what board control is. It's controlling your opponent's movements, controlling your opponent's decisions, and influencing what they do in a game to your favor. And just like in any strategy game, whether it be an RTS or whether it be a tabletop game, if you have board control over your opponent, you have map control, then you have the advantage in the game. And just like any old school RTS player will tell you, and yes, I did play a lot of Dawn of War when I was a kid. I loved that game, but one of my first mistakes was that when I first started playing that game online, I thought I could just sit in my base and turtle and camp and just build turrets. You cannot do that. You will lose instantly. It is not a viable strategy. And the same can be said of the Craftworld Eldar on the tabletop. You can't just sit in a corner and camp. That's the same with any army, really. 10th edition is all about board control, all about capturing objectives, and you need to be able to do that to a reasonable degree to be able to win your games. Okay, so I did want to make a quick note on Overwatch, because Overwatch is one of those mechanics in 10th edition that has a lot of influence, not only on the metagame, but on your army as well as the Craftworld Eldar. Both ways. So Overwatch is a very powerful denial tool for us that's available in 10th edition, and it's great when used properly on both sides. Your opponent can use it very well, and you can use it very well. Unlike in 9th edition, Overwatch has a 24-inch range and can be used whenever an enemy is set up, starts a move or charge, or ends a move or charge. Now, the kicker though is that it can only be used in the movement or charge phase, and your opponent's movement or charge phase to be specific. So it can't be used in your movement phase or your turn at all. It cannot be used in any other phase in the game. Which means your opponent can't use it for things like Fire and Fade and Phantasm, because those are not in their opponent's movement or charge phases. So do keep that in mind. You can safely Phantasm and not worry about being overwatched, because those do not happen in your movement phase or charge phase. And that is also something you have to keep in mind for yourself, especially when considering things like rapid ingress. So every army has access to that ability, and it happens at the end of your movement phase. And because it's not your opponent's movement phase or your opponent's charge phase, you cannot overwatch, because that's not when overwatch happens. So do keep that in mind. However, if your opponent just rapid ingresses right in front of your army, you could just shoot it normally in your own shooting phase, but still, you do have to keep that in mind that you can't just overwatch them at that point. You do also want to keep range and line of sight in mind. You do need the range on your weapons and the line of sight to the target to be able to successfully overwatch them, or else it will fail. Guide can also make Overwatch extremely lethal, and because it lasts for the whole round, not only does Guide affect our own shooting, but it also affects Overwatch as well. And this can be exceptionally powerful with units like Dire Avengers who already Overwatch on a better ballistic skill. Okay, so in 10th edition, we have a lot of new tools to help us with board control. Some of them are tools we had before, and some of them are new. So here are our tools for helping control the board. So we have Dire Avengers, Swooping Hawks and Warp Spiders, Fire Dragons and a Falcon, which was a classic board control tactic I used last edition, which still works, D-Cannon support weapons, Night Spinners, Rangers and Striking Scorpions, Prince Royale, Wraithguard, and lastly, the mighty Wraithlord. So starting with Dire Avengers are a board control unit now, and that is because they basically have an ability to Overwatch on a 4+, which is extremely powerful at denying areas of the board. So if you can Overwatch on a 4+ when in range of an objective you control, makes it extremely hard for enemies to approach you with their infantry. And if you throw Guide on them, it effectively prevents enemy infantry units from pushing up the board without taking substantial damage when they stumble into their range of 18 inches. Which I know Dire Avengers don't have the best range in the world, but 18 inches is good enough to basically deny a large area from your opponents. Furthermore, Dire Avengers have lethal hits, which means they can hit a lot harder against those targets even if they have a worse ballistic skill. And just think about it like this. With Guide, you're getting even more chances to proc those lethal hits in the first place. So this is an extremely powerful denial tool, and it's something that I've used in the edition to quite some good effect, as well as other players have. And basically what it means is that enemy infantry, things like intercessors or Infernus squads or other units that want to close quickly with your army, are going to have trouble getting through this area of denial. So unit of 5 Infernus Marines walking up into range, trying to get their flamers off on these guys, which, by the way, Infernus flamers will take Dire Avengers apart quite easily. However, they're going to have to brave Overwatch first on a 4+, and maybe with Guide, maybe with rerolls to hit. So that's going to make your opponent think twice, as they're not going to want to throw away their Infernus squad to Overwatch. Which is something that, is fairly expensive. Infernus squads are fairly high value, but they do have to get very close to enemy units to be able to be useful. And this can be used to your advantage. So Dire Avengers are a very powerful denial tool in our army, and one of the key aspects to being able to control the board in 10th edition. Swooping Hawks and Warp Spiders are also key to controlling the board, but not in the same way Dire Avengers are. What I like about this Eldar index is we have a lot of different units that do a lot of different things, and if board control is their game, they like to do it in different ways. Whereas that wasn't really the case last edition. Last edition, we had a lot of units that essentially did the same thing. So what Swooping Hawks and Warp Spiders are great at doing, and how they control the board, is that they are great at scoring secondary objectives. Now, that might not seem like a board control tactic, but it actually is, because what it does is it forces your opponent to leave units behind to deal with them or give up their backfield as a result. Warp Spiders can move 24 inches, which is basically the whole board. They can get behind enemy lines very quickly and score on a plethora of secondaries and make it very easy for you to max out your secondaries on. And Swooping Hawks can just skyleap and deep strike anywhere they want, whenever they want, the next turn. And because this is done at the end of your opponent's turn, they're going to have to worry about those Swooping Hawks possibly getting into their backlines, and as a result, they're most likely going to keep something behind to deal with them, whether that be just a squad of 5 intercessors or anything like that. And this can be really detrimental. I mean, it may not seem like it, but keeping your opponent's units in the backfield is a way to control the board, right? Normally, something small can guard an objective. Like if your opponent has a long-range vehicle in the backfield, something like a whirlwind with indirect fire that can just sit in the back and shoot safely from behind obscuring terrain, it's sitting on an objective in the back. It has objective control 3, or maybe 2. I don't exactly know what the whirlwind has, but it's something low. They will have to worry about that Swooping Hawk unit coming in and taking that objective from the whirlwind. As 5 Swooping Hawks does have a higher objective control than the whirlwind does. So basically, you can always just charge the Swooping Hawks in after Deep Strike, use a Fate dice, roll a 3+, and grab that objective. That's going to be something your opponent has to worry about. Or if your opponent has some sort of sticky objective mechanic, which is something that's the case in a lot of missions, then they're going to have to physically leave a unit behind to be able to guard that objective because they know the Swooping Hawks will just easily land on it and take it for themselves. And the same thing goes with Warp Spiders, who are really good at getting around the board very quickly, and they do have the basic Deep Strike as well, so they could just be in reserve from the start of the game. And the more units your opponent has to camp in the backfield, the better your chances will be of being able to control the board successfully. Alright, so moving on to Fire Dragons in a Falcon. So Fire Dragons are something that a lot of people write off as a control-based unit. They kind of think of it more as a trading unit, something that kills something and then immediately dies. But Fire Dragons also play a very severe mental game with your opponent. They have a nasty reputation for being able to wipe out tanks very easily, and if they are in a Falcon, they can actually do this. They actually live up to that name. Having a 29-inch threat range from your backfield, or 23 inches if you want to get in half range and get that melt to 3 bonus, makes them hit very hard, especially with the wound rerolls of the Falcon. And between the Falcon's firepower and the firepower of the Fire Dragons, these guys can indeed take out big stuff like Land Raiders and Battle Wagons. Yes, they will be wounding on 5s, but keep in mind they are rerolling all of their wound rolls. And the Fire Pike is going to be wounding on 4+ because it's strength 12. On top of that, if your opponent doesn't have a good invul save, then they're going to be in trouble because each wound that goes through is at AP -4. At most, your opponent will probably get a 6-up save. And each shot that goes through is going to do 7.5 damage on average. And remember that Fire Dragons can also reroll 1s on their damage rolls as well. So if you do roll really bad on your damage roll, that's okay. Fire Dragons can reroll it, which is great. On top of that, the Falcon is, usually packing a pretty powerful punch as well. The Pulse Laser is pretty good, and of course the Bright Lance is amazing, especially with a Fate Dice if you need it. So this is a very scary unit against vehicles. I know their Strength 9 is a little bit, less than desirable, but unlike other factions, Melt-to-Weapons getting rerolls to wound and, rerolls to 1 on damage and stuff like that is actually pretty effective. Opponents are going to think twice before moving a high-value vehicle or monster into that range. Even if it is a lighter vehicle or monster, maybe a little bit more expendable, they're still going to think twice because Fire Dragons are really cheap. And the good news is, because of Fire and Fade, you do not even have to sacrifice your Falcon. If you want to save the Falcon, you can always spend the 2 command points for the Fire and Fade and move it back to safety. This is something I have done on several occasions, and my 5 Fire Dragons have been able to trade quite effectively with things moving into the midboard. And sometimes, if you're lucky and your opponent placed something near a piece of obscuring terrain, you can just use Phantasm, skirt behind that piece of obscuring terrain, and be out of line of sight for most of your opponent's army. Again, they might still die, but it is a chance they'll survive, and you do want to measure that and see if the Fire Dragons will be of further use in that game. These guys also overlap extremely well with different denial units. So you can kind of set up multiple layers of denial that your opponent will have to worry about, right? So Dire Avengers are good at denying infantry, but are weak against vehicles, which the Fire Dragons can deal with. So a common tactic that opponents will do is they'll say, okay, well, your Dire Avengers are really good against infantry, but how will they deal with a Dreadnought? How will they deal with a Rhino or something like that it can just shove in their face and just make it impossible for them to deny that area of the board, which opponents will do. Opponents will move Rhinos up into range, dump their guys behind them, and block line of sight. I've seen this a million times because, Rhinos are just blocks basically. So they can dump their unit behind it and the Rhino blocks line of sight to that unit. So you basically lose your great Overwatch target. Now the bonus to this is that your opponent's unit can't see you either, so therefore can't shoot. But your opponent can play the waiting game, right? Your opponent knows unless you have a way to kill that Rhino quickly, my guys are safe behind it and they're safe to Overwatch and I can safely advance them up the board. But if you have Fire Dragons waiting in your backfield, that's an easy target for them, right? They can just hop forward, kill the Rhino. Your Dire Avengers can unload on the infantry. And at that point, your Dire Avengers can continue to deny ground to your opponent. So they work really well together, and an Eldar army, after all, is all about synergy, and Dire Avengers work very well in denying infantry, and Fire Dragons work very well in denying vehicles and monsters and other big stuff that, normally the Dire Avengers wouldn't be able to handle. All right, now here is the unit that probably most of you think about when you think about area denial, and that is the D-Cannon support weapon. So this is an extremely hard-hitting anti-large platform with indirect fire and devastating wounds, so that means it can also take out infantry if it needs to, but probably more high-value infantry, right? Light infantry it's not so good against. It has a 27-inch threat range, which includes its 3 inches of movement and 24-inch range. So it can safely cover no man's land pretty easily. If you have it in your deployment zone behind some obscuring terrain, behind some ruins, maybe on the bottom story or something where it can't be seen, then it can easily just fire over that. It also has the heavy keyword, so keep in mind it will be firing accurately against targets that it can't see. And from there, it can just basically cover all the middle objectives on the board. So if your opponent wants to move something of high value to the middle, they're going to have to risk a shot from this thing. With Fate Dice, even Overwatch can hit surprisingly hard against single targets. You use a 6 on your Fate Dice, you get a 6 to hit, you're probably going to wound because you have a really high strength, and you get a reroll onto wound, right, because of Unparalleled Mastery. So you will get a wound, let's just be real. And then you're going to be doing D6 plus 2 damage to that target, and if you roll a 1 on damage, you can always command reroll it, right? You can always spend a command point to do a command reroll, which is not the best use of command points, but hey, if you roll a 1 and you whiff, you do want to actually use that on that target because that could be a high value target. And believe it or not, this is pretty effective against smaller vehicles and monsters, things that are a little bit weaker, single targets that don't have a lot of wounds, you know, things with like 6 wounds or less typically. Even land speeders on the higher end can be, you know, dealt with pretty effectively. You may not be able to one-shot it, but you can at least get it close to dying so that your other elements can take it out more easily. But on the upper end, if you get lucky and roll that 6, and you get that 8 wounds on damage, that thing's out of there. But even if you don't roll that high amount, and you get an average roll, you're still damaging it considerably and allowing other units to take it out more easily. So you don't have to waste a Bright Lance on it, you don't have to waste a high-powered shot to kill it. Now, another cool thing you can do with the support weapon is you can tag non-vehicle and monster units with -1 to hit. Now, normally this wouldn't be a consideration because monsters and vehicles are really all you're going to be going after with the D-Cannon. But it's not just limited to the actual D-Cannon. You can tag units with the Shuriken Catapult as well. Yes, that's right. The ability does not specify that the attacks have to come from the D-Cannon or the support weapon to actually proc this ability. The Shuriken Catapult itself can be fired at a unit. You can split fire it at something else and tag it with that -1 to hit. So you can basically, if you wanted to, move this thing up 3 inches, move it, you know, where it has line of sight on an enemy infantry unit, maybe a shooting base unit. You can tag it with that Shuriken Catapult in the midfield, give it -1 to hit, fire the D-Cannon at something else, and then phantasm back behind obscuring terrain. And of course, you know, basically be safe from enemy return fire, except if it's indirect or ignores line of sight, which there are a few things in the game which do, so you do have to watch out for that. But even so, right, 105 points is pretty expensive, but you're getting a lot of value out of that. And especially for the control game, opponents will be very wary of basically putting anything into range of this thing. Not only because of its Overwatch potential, but its actual firepower and the fact that it can also debuff enemy units with a hit modifier is very powerful. Okay, so next up is the Night Spinner. So the Night Spinner wasn't a control element in last edition, and it is now because it has a cool new special rule. So basically the Night Spinners slow down enemy units by reducing movement by 2 inches and preventing advancing. So you pick an enemy unit that you hit with the Doom Spinner, or you know, I can't remember, the Doom Weaver, I think it's called. And that enemy unit is at -2 movement and also cannot advance. And this is an extremely powerful ability on a unit that has indirect fire. So if this thing had direct fire, it would be much less powerful, right? Because you would need line of sight to that unit, which means you would need to make the Night Spinner vulnerable. But because it has indirect fire, it can basically hit anything on the board. And what this means is you can counter one of the biggest weaknesses of control-based armies, which is really fast units that do a lot of damage, right? So you can reduce the speed of faster units considerably, preventing them from getting around your flanks and getting better positions on you. And you can slow heavy units to an absolute crawl, making it hard for them to get to objectives in the first place. So unless your opponent has some kind of bullshit dark obscuration ability, yes, I'm looking at you, Abaddon, then your Night Spinner is going to be slowing that unit down to a crawl and making it impossible for them to get onto objectives quickly. Which again is just victory points in your pocket. Because it means now your opponent is going to have to divert other faster forces to be able to take that center objective. And guess what? Those faster forces are not going to be nearly as tough and will be easy to pick off for the rest of your army. And due to this, the Night Spinner makes the absolutely perfect support piece for your other control elements. It makes their job a lot easier and a lot more manageable. Okay, so moving on to Rangers and Striking Scorpions. So Rangers and Striking Scorpions are control pieces, and, they're not typically the best damage dealers. Even Striking Scorpions, they do good damage, but it's not anything amazing. So what do you use these guys for? Well, they both have the infiltrate ability, so they can block enemy infiltrators and scouting units. One of the weaknesses of control-based lists, or just trying to control the board in general, is losing out board space to infiltrators. Right? Like if your opponent has a good amount of scouting elements or infiltrating elements, they can move up the board very quickly and deny that space from your own units. You want to get your Dire Avengers onto objectives in the mid board, but if, your enemy already has scouts on that objective, you can't benefit from the 4+ Overwatch, which means you're not going to be able to deny board space as effectively. So to prevent this, using Rangers and Striking Scorpions to block those positions out early on in the game is really important. Scorpions can also be held in reserve to keep opponents away from the edges of the battlefield. Again, what is the weakness of control-based lists? Lists with a lot of, D cannons, Night Spinners in the back, providing control. Well, it's getting around the flanks, being fast, and getting behind your enemy, right? If your opponent can throw a lot of stuff in your face all at once, control armies tend to fall apart. So the best way to prevent this is to use Scorpions as kind of a deterrent, saying, yes, you can use the sides of the boards, but you're going to get charged if you do. So beware of that. Also, Rangers can secure objectives for your Dire Avengers early, which is very good synergy. In addition, Rangers are also cheap enough to block fast-moving, non-flying enemy units. Of course, it won't work against flying units. They can just fly right over you. But for things on the ground like Orc bikes, Orc trucks, attack bikes, things like that, Outriders, Rangers can block a significant amount of their movement from turn 1. Especially on a WA turn. Just think about it for a second. Orc WAs are absolutely insane. They're getting movement 14, plus they're getting an advance, plus they're getting a charge. That's pretty insane threat range. So if you can reduce their movement and basically block them from being able to do that on their WA turn or a turn that they want to WA on, they're not going to be as fast, and you're going to cut a lot of their speed out of the equation. So against certain opponents, do not be afraid to sacrifice your Rangers. They're only 55 points, but you can buy yourself precious turns in which the other elements of your army can shoot for longer. And if you're still shooting as an Eldar player in turn 5, turn 4, you're probably going to win if you have enough elements that can do that effectively. So I know some players might shy away from sacrificing units, but just keep in mind that you are sacrificing a unit of Rangers, a 55-point unit of Rangers, to save possibly hundreds of points of other units. Because yeah, if a unit of Orc knobs on bikes gets into your backfield, you're basically done. That's it. Game over. If they get into your backfield like that, there's nothing much that can stop them. So yeah, I would rather sacrifice a unit of Rangers than have that happen. And also another benefit is how consolidation and pile-in moves work now. Opponents, when they pile in, have to get into base contact with enemy models, and they can't just get extra movement out of it. And on the same token, they cannot consolidate unless they are consolidating closer to an enemy unit or to an objective. So assault units can't just get free movement anymore. So if you want a movement block away from an objective, the Rangers are going to get wiped out, and once they get wiped out by that combat unit, they'll have nowhere to go, and they'll just basically be sitting there. So they're not going to get extra movement from that, so don't worry about that happening this edition. Okay, so speaking of Rangers, next we have Prince Royale. So Prince Royale works really well with Rangers because he allows them to redeploy after they're done deploying. So they can infiltrate up the battlefield. They can block off key enemy units from getting up the battlefield and controlling the mid-board before the game even begins, like scouts and stuff like that have the infiltrate rule. And then from there, he can redeploy them into your own deployment zone. So if you don't want to stay out there, so you've movement blocked all your enemies from getting onto objectives, but you really don't want to just keep them out there in the middle to where they can get shot at and killed, then you can always move them back into your own deployment zone for safety. So being able to move additional units also into reserve is extremely useful in playing mind games with your opponent and influencing where your opponent deploys. So, did you use the Scorpions to block enemy infiltrators, but now they're out in the open? Well, just move them back into reserve so that they can continue to influence your opponent's choices throughout the entire game. That is the power of Prince Royale. So a lot of players might scoff at paying 100 points for this guy just for redeployment ability, but also keep in mind he gives the unit that he's with an extra objective control. So that unit of Guardians on the objective in your own backfield is going to be a little bit harder to steal that objective away from. And again, this all goes back down to playing the control game, right? Denying your opponent's board space, denying your opponent's the ability to get quick, easy objectives. And Guardians with Prince Royale is actually quite an effective way of defending your backfield against things coming out from reserve. So your opponent might place things in reserve and wait until turn 3 to come in behind you. Well, Guardians happen to be kind of good at screening that stuff out. Okay, so the next unit that we're going to talk about is Wraithguard. Now, Wraithguard may seem to you like just a high damaging unit that's very tough that is there to control mid-board objectives. However, because of their ability, they also play a very good control game. So they are a tough unit that shoots back when attacked, forcing opponents to think very carefully about their shooting order and the Wraithguard's threat range. Your opponent may be unwilling to leave a vulnerable target within 18 inches of these guys if they know that they can shoot them right back, right? And again, they don't have to shoot the unit that shot at them. They can shoot at any unit within 18 inches. So that is something your opponent has to consider. Now, Wraithguard did get a recent nerf. Now they don't have the pistol keyword when shooting back, so opponents are encouraged to engage them in close combat. Close combat is Wraithguard's true weakness now. However, use this weakness to allure your enemy units out into the open where your other units can obliterate it. So basically this, right? You have an opponent that doesn't want to engage you at range, but wants to engage you in close combat. Perhaps with a very high value melee unit. So there's one or two things you can do here. One, you can use Phantasm to move your unit back and hopefully out of the charge range. Basically make your opponent choose. Do you want to sit on that objective that I was camping and control it? Or do you want to kill my Wraithguard? Because you cannot do both if I use Phantasm. Or you let that melee unit engage the Wraithguard. They're probably not going to kill all of them, especially if you have a unit of 10 and a Spirit Seer, which is probably how you should run them. You let them engage. They'll probably kill maybe 4 Wraithguard if they're a pretty strong unit, which is a great trade. Your Wraithguard will not fight back well because they're just not that great in combat. They will kill a few maybe, but not many. They have a decent number of attacks and good strength, but they don't really have any AP or damage, so Wraithguard typically don't do well in combat at all against certain units. So if your opponent is, fighting them with a serious combat unit, they are going to lose over the course of a couple turns. However, your turn comes around, and then you can fall back. Right, so basically what happens is that melee unit is most likely not going to control the objective. If you have 7 models on the objective with objective control 1, and they don't have 7 models, you're still going to control that objective. Unless they're a battle line unit, which they probably won't be. Again, to be able to kill 4 Wraithguard, they're probably going to need to be pretty elite, right? So they're going to come in, they're not going to be able to control the objective. You can then fall back, use the stratagem that allows you to shoot when falling back, and just shoot that unit off the objective completely. You can then fire and fade right back onto the objective as if nothing ever happened. And you'll have your 7 Wraithguard, 6 plus the revived one, back on the objective, controlling it just like normal. And as a result, your opponent lost a very high value melee unit that is now just going to be basically dumpstered in the trash can. So yeah, Wraithguard, while they may not seem like a control element, they are, because there's a lot of things an opponent has to think about before engaging them, which can make it hard to deal with them and can make them control that area of the board very well. All right, so last on our list is the Wraithlord. So the Wraithlord is on this list not because he can control the board in any kind of way, but because he can defend your backline elements very well. He protects backline elements with timely heroic interventions and disincentivizes combat units from engaging your backline. Again, your backline is the most vulnerable part of your army, and it's the part of your army you need to keep alive to be able to control the board, or else you're just going to lose control, and chances are lose the game. So having a strong melee unit that can heroically intervene like this is a really good way of protecting your backline and your weaker elements. He also provides decent range support as well, so it's not like he's just useless sitting in the back just waiting for that to happen. While that's going on, he is very tough and he can provide some good long-range fire support with his Bright Lances or Eldar missile launchers. Okay, so there are two things though that you do need to watch out for when trying to play the board control game with your opponent. One of those things is to watch out for enemy reserves and extremely fast units. So like I said earlier in this video, extremely fast units and reserves can absolutely wreck your backline, so do be careful about them. And you can shut these units down by screening them out or prioritizing their destruction. So if you see orc bikes on the field, make sure they're dead or screened. If you see something that's, going to come from reserve, make sure they're screened out properly so they don't just wreak havoc in your backline. And make sure you deploy your forces in overlapping layers of denial. So Rangers secure positions for Dire Avengers, Fire Dragons and D-Cannons cover the Dire Avengers, the Dire Avengers cover the D-Cannons from enemy infantry units, and the Scorpions protect the flanks. All aspects of your army should be synergizing and working together to cover each other's weaknesses so that there's no breaks in the chain. As one weak link will often mean the destruction of your entire strategy and eventually your army. Okay, so some of you might be thinking, well, that's all well and good, you saying that I should position my units in a way that covers each other, but what does that actually look like? What does that look like on a board, right? Because you could explain it in words, but maybe I don't know what that looks like on the tabletop. So I'm going to show you guys an example of how denial units look when properly positioned. Okay, now this is not quite to scale, but this is an example of what your unit should look like when they're supporting each other. So everything is labeled. So we have the D-Cannons with the circles, and they're clear circles just there in the back on the left side. We have our Falcon and Night Spinner in the back. They're the triangles. We have our Wave Serpent kind of up there. The Wave Serpent drops off the Dire Avengers in the middle of the battlefield on an objective. And in front of the Dire Avengers, we have the Rangers. Now, over in the enemy's deployment zone, we see their elements. Now, if you've done this correctly, your Rangers should have been in positions to where your enemy couldn't really infiltrate properly, so wasn't able to get a lot of their infiltrators out into the center of the battlefield. And basically, you just have a situation where a lot of the units are supporting each other. So after the Rangers deploy, you can either use them to screen, like if that enemy unit on the top right is a very fast bike unit or something like that, that can easily get around and shoot at your Dire Avengers or, threaten your flanks or anything kind of like in that ballpark. You can easily block them out with the Rangers. At the same time, if that's not a unit that can be fast and get around the Dire Avengers and kill them quickly, then your Rangers probably don't need to be screening them out, and they can always redeploy back into their own deployment zone using Prince Royale. Again, Prince Royale is a very good control tool for this. The Night Spinner on the bottom left is basically used to slow down enemy units that might be a threat to the Dire Avengers or the flanks of the battlefield. And of course, you could also have striking Scorpions in reserve to keep your opponents away from the edges of the battlefield. So if your opponent advances towards the center objectives, which they probably will, there's a lot of armies out there that just basically play that game. They advance to the center. You have that pretty well covered with your Dire Avengers as well as your D-Cannons. If they try to advance towards the flanks, you have striking Scorpions in reserve. Most likely, you'll also have Swooping Hawks or other fast elements that can contest those opponents on the flanks and wipe out their faster units quickly. Or if they don't really have faster units, force your opponent to basically stay in their own backfield and guard their own objectives. Because again, the faster elements in your army will be able to grab them. And as you can kind of see by this diagram, there's no real effective ways your opponent can engage you without taking some major casualties on the way. If your opponent wants to engage you with infantry, you have Dire Avengers, right? You could even go and do this further with a Zerman if you wanted to boost even more damage. Put a Zerman with 10 Dire Avengers and have another unit of 10 Dire Avengers basically doing the same thing and getting double the Overwatch. That's something you can very well do. So as far as an infantry assault is concerned, your opponent is going to struggle with that. Your opponent is also going to struggle putting hard targets in the middle of the battlefield because you have D cannons and a falcon with fire dragons that can come out at any time and basically burn them to a crisp. And keep in mind also, if you do have a Zerman in your list, you can basically overwatch twice. Once with the Zerman's unit, and then of course once with something like a D cannon. So that is also, again, something to think about when you're thinking about making a control-based list, or simply understanding how to control the board better. Now, the one weakness this list does have, though, if you don't have the right terrain setups, is both indirect fire and towering. Towering especially. If you go after something like Imperial Knights, they will be able to dismantle the pieces that you need to be able to control the board. So your D cannons are going to be the first to go. Followed by that, they're going to disable the Falcon, kill the Fire Dragons, and then basically just walk all over your infantry, because Overwatch is good, but it's not good enough to kill a Knight. So that's something you have to look out for as well. To balance that out and to kind of make it a little bit more fair, if you are going against that kind of matchup, it's probably best to agree with your opponent that the bottom story of Ruins block true line of sight, or have them just block line of sight completely, so that you don't get murdered in your first turn. So you can have something like a D cannon support weapon sitting behind a ruin and not have it killed in one turn, right? Because towering is such a monstrously good special rule. A lot of tournaments have adopted this, so if you're worried about creating an unfair advantage to yourself, don't worry about it. Tournaments have also basically come up with the, towering is too powerful and it needed to be reined in a little bit. So don't feel bad about using this. It's not going to give you an unfair advantage. It's just going to level the playing field so that, if you're going against someone who has Imperial Knights, they're not going to just wipe you off the board in a single round of shooting. However, that's not going to protect you against indirect fire, and you do need ways of dealing with that indirect fire. So another thing you can do is if your opponent has a lot of indirect fire elements, you can put your D cannons in reserve. If you're going against a guard player that's spamming artillery, for example, well, your D cannons aren't really going to do much with that 24 inches, and they're not going to do much against the infantry that is advancing in the midboard. So just put them in reserve, right? That way, when they come out of reserve, they can open fire on some of those indirect elements, those wyverns, those basilisks, and they can deal significant damage to them. D cannons will, on average, kill something like a basilisk or a wyvern on arrival. And just remember with those, you are getting a reroll to hit and you are getting a reroll to wound. So that is something to consider. You will have a good chance of killing those models when you come in on the board. And yeah, basilisks and wyverns and assault artillery like that don't really have the best armor either, and they don't have invuls. So any damage that goes through is damage that's just going to go through, pure and simple. But other than that, as long as you deploy your forces in a way in which they cover each other and cover each other's weaknesses and also put pressure on enemy units, the control game is actually something that is really viable for the Craftworld Eldar. And in fact, it's one of the best ways to run them. And even if you're not running a control-based list, a lot of Eldar lists have control baked into them. And I mean, just look at Dire Avengers. Dire Avengers are a very good anti-infantry unit. They're very good at shooting, but they also have a heavy control element to them. And again, it's something I'm running in this example list right now. I'm also running Fire Dragons and a Falcon because they are very good at controlling the board, and so are Swooping Hawks, Striking Scorpions, and Warp Spiders. So even though you might be trying to run a more aggressive list, you certainly should keep in mind that you can also play the control game as well, even if you're running a more fast and aggressive list of Aspect Warriors. Alright, so in conclusion, controlling the board can be a difficult concept to grasp at first, especially for a newer player. I know when I started Warhammer 40k, I had no idea what board control meant, and I had no idea what threat range meant, and of course back then you couldn't pre-measure. Some of you guys might have remembered those old days back in like 3rd edition when you couldn't pre-measure things. You guys remember that, when you had to just guess if the unit was in range or not? And then of course if you guessed wrong, your unit just couldn't shoot because it couldn't pick another target. Do you guys remember that? Well, luckily now we have pre-measuring, so it's a little bit easier to gauge those distances and control the board better and more accurately. However, with the large amount of denial tools available to us, as long as you keep enemy threat range and manage your defensive resources wisely, you will be able to force opponents into situations that don't have a happy ending for them. So even though board control can be a difficult concept, we have so many tools in this edition to control the board that as long as you do manage your resources and know the special rules and how they interact and make sure that your units are supporting each other, you will force a lot of bad situations for opponents where there's really no good answer. And I gave you guys a few examples of that in this video, things like, well, your opponent doesn't want to get overwatched, so he moves up behind a rhino to block line of sight. Well, you have a D cannon that can overwatch the rhino, which probably won't kill it, but you also have fire dragons that can come out and kill the rhino. And then, your dire Avengers kill the unit hiding behind it, and your opponent is back at square one. Or your opponent has to choose between leaving an opponent behind to deal with your faster elements, like swooping hawks and warp spiders, or having them join the battle and have an impact on the middle of the board, which is probably where your opponent would prefer them to be. So forcing opponents into those choices can have a very big impact on the game as a whole. And, of course, it'll be to your advantage. All right, everybody, that is going to be it for today's video. Thanks for watching. Thank you to all my patrons and supporters who have helped this channel over the last months. Your help has been greatly appreciated. If you do want to join the Patreon, I do have free trials set up for you. A free trial will get you access to our Discord community free of charge, and you will have permanent access whether you choose to continue the free trial or not. And I'm just going to say it, our Discord community has a lot of awesome people in it and a lot of cool players. If you are wanting to, find a place that you can call home, that you can talk to, other nerds like me about the Eldar, that is going to be the place for you. And again, you can do it at no charge. I also have a channel store page if you want to pick up some Eldar-inspired apparel to rep at your local game store. I will leave the link in the description for you guys to go ahead and find that. All right, everybody, that's going to be it for today. Peace out. See you guys next time. We're going to continue our series on Harlequins tomorrow. Have a great week, everybody. Have some good games this weekend, and I'll see you guys later. Have a good one, everybody. Peace out.